The studio lights blazed down with the intensity of miniature suns, bathing the sprawling talk show set in a theatrical glow. The stage was a careful blend of glitz and comfort. Soft velvet couches in shades of wine red, polished oak tables with sleek water glasses, and a city skyline backdrop twinkling artificially with neon blues and yellows. Above, cameras hummed on automated tracks, their metallic arms sweeping silently to capture every angle of the night's spectacle. A restless energy buzzed through the crowd, a sea of eager faces leaning forward in anticipation, each member of the audience aware that tonight was not just another show. The host, a charismatic figure with a voice polished smooth from years on air, paced across the stage with a mischievous grin stretching across his face. "Ladies and gentlemen," he boomed, his words bouncing against the rafters, "tonight we have not one, but two Hollywood legends sharing the same couch." The crowd erupted, clapping, whistling, stamping feet against the risers. The first to be introduced was Will Smith. The curtains parted, and he strode onto the stage with a swagger that was unmistakably his own. Will radiated confidence. His smile stretched wide and unshakable, his hand movements exaggerated yet natural, as if every gesture were crafted to command attention. He slapped hands with the host, exchanged playful nods with audience members, even winked at a group of young fans clutching handmade posters. The cheers swelled louder, and Will reveled in it, arms stretched like a victorious prizefighter. "Will Smith, everyone," the host declared, motioning toward the couch. Will flopped down with practiced ease, spreading out like the stage belonged to him, tapping his foot in rhythm with the fading applause. He leaned back, basking in the limelight, feeding off the electric energy in the room. Then came the second introduction, and joining him, the host continued, voice dropping into a more reverent tone, a man whose presence needs no embellishment, the legendary Keanu Reeves. The studio shifted. The applause was still thunderous, but there was a noticeable difference in tone, less explosive, more reverent, as though the audience had unconsciously adjusted themselves for Keanu's energy. From behind the curtains, Keanu walked slowly, deliberately, almost as if the world around him moved at double speed. He wore a dark blazer, understated yet elegant, and his long black hair framed his face in gentle waves. No grand gestures, no exaggerated smiles. Just a small nod, a hand raised briefly in gratitude, and eyes that seemed to hold entire universes of experience. Where Will commanded attention like a spotlight, Keanu absorbed it like a quiet flame in a dark room. The applause became a kind of hush, the kind of sound people make when they're unsure whether to cheer or to simply watch. Keanu reached the couch, shook the host's hand with humility, and settled into the seat beside Will. His posture was composed, hands resting lightly on his knees, shoulders relaxed, gaze lowered as if the roaring crowd didn't belong to him but to the moment itself. The host clapped his hands together and grinned at the camera. Two icons, side by side. Tonight is going to be unforgettable. The camera cut to the audience, faces lit with excitement, some already pulling out phones in hopes of snapping an image, others whispering predictions of how the evening might unfold. The world had just been handed a perfect storm, the exuberant king of charisma and the stoic master of restraint sharing a stage. As the noise died down, the host leaned toward Will. "You look fired up tonight, man." Will chuckled, his laughter booming, effortless. "Oh, you know me," he said, gesturing widely. "I live for this energy. Put me in front of a crowd, and it's like plugging into the sun." He clapped his hands, sending the audience into another cheer. The host turned to Keanu. "And you, Keanu, how do you feel in moments like this?" Keanu lifted his head slowly, his expression thoughtful. His voice was soft, almost understated, but it carried an unexpected weight. "Grateful," he said simply. "Always grateful to be here, to share a space, to connect." The audience erupted in applause again, but it was different this time. Not loud laughter or wild cheers, but a respectful acknowledgement. Will glanced sideways at Keanu, a smirk playing at the corners of his mouth. The contrast was undeniable. Will was the storm, vibrant and unpredictable, demanding the room's attention. Keanu was the calm ocean, steady, patient, reflecting the lights without trying to outshine them. The host shifted in his seat, sensing the balance of energy. "This is already fascinating," he chuckled, gesturing between the two men. On one side, Mr. High Voltage himself, Will Smith. On the other, the Zen master of Hollywood, Keanu Reeves. The audience roared with laughter and applause, enjoying the playful contrast. Will leaned forward, his eyes twinkling mischievously. "I mean, look at him," Will said, gesturing toward Keanu. "He's just so calm. Like if the building caught fire right now, he'd just nod and say, 'We should probably leave.' Meanwhile, I'd be screaming and grabbing fire extinguishers." The crowd erupted in laughter again, clapping and cheering. The host chuckled, hiding a grin behind his cue cards. Keanu smiled faintly, lowering his gaze, as though the joke had rolled over him without leaving a dent. But in that moment, just for a second, the camera caught it. A flicker in Keanu's eyes, something unreadable. Not irritation, not amusement, but a quiet acknowledgement. The kind of look that suggested he had already measured the room, weighed the energy, and decided when, or if, he would respond. The host cleared his throat. "Well, this is going to be interesting," he said. "Two legends, two energies, one stage. Buckle up, everyone." The lights brightened, the applause swelled again, and the curtain of polite introductions fell away. Behind the smiles and laughter, an undercurrent of tension had already begun to form. The night was young, but the audience could feel it. Something was brewing. The stage was set. The laughter lingered in the air like smoke, curling around the edges of the set as the host shuffled his cue cards. Will Smith leaned further into the couch, his body language radiating comfort and control. He thrived in this space. The cameras adored him, the audience fed him energy, and he, in turn, fed them back with charm and rhythm. Each word he spoke carried the bounce of a punchline, each gesture deliberately oversized to draw attention. Keanu, by contrast, sat still, hands folded loosely in his lap, his movements measured. He was not uncomfortable, but he seemed untouched by the frenzy around him, as if he were an island in the middle of a storm. The juxtaposition fascinated the audience, and even the host couldn't resist pointing it out. "I've got lightning and water sitting on my couch tonight." The crowd roared, and Will beamed, flashing that familiar grin that could command an entire room. He was in his element, but the seed of mischief was already germinating behind his eyes. Will leaned toward Keanu, lowering his voice but loud enough for the microphones to catch. "Man, you are so chill. Like, too chill. I don't think I've ever seen you crack, bro." The crowd chuckled, sensing where this might be going. Will seized on their reaction, tilting his head dramatically and mimicking Keanu's famously slow and deliberate cadence. "Whoa, life is beautiful. Whoa, let's just breathe, guys." The audience erupted in laughter, some clapping, others whistling, feeding Will's performance. The host laughed nervously, glancing toward Keanu to gauge his reaction. Keanu, however, offered only a faint smile, his eyes dropping momentarily to the floor before lifting again with that same calm, unreadable gaze. The moment stretched, and for a heartbeat, the audience wasn't sure whether he would respond. But Keanu simply nodded once, the small smile still lingering, as if to acknowledge the impression without offering resistance. It was a masterclass in restraint, and the silence that followed spoke louder than any comeback. Sensing that the audience wanted more, Will pressed on, his tone still playful but carrying a sharper edge. "No, but seriously, Keanu, man, do you ever, get excited? I mean, here I am bouncing off the walls, and you're sitting there like Buddha on vacation." The laughter bubbled again, though it carried a nervous tinge this time, like the sound of people unsure whether they should laugh or brace themselves. Will wasn't done. He leaned back, spreading his arms wide, and launched into another impression. This time he exaggerated Keanu's stillness, sitting stiffly with a blank expression, his voice dropping to a deep monotone. Hi, I'm Keanu Reeves. I save the world in movies, but in real life, I just sit here. Thank you." The crowd burst out laughing, some doubling over, the host covering his mouth with his cue cards. The energy was explosive, but beneath it ran an undercurrent of tension, like a guitar string pulled too tight. The cameras cut to Keanu again, zooming in on his face. His expression remained neutral, though his eyes flickered, carrying the weight of someone who had weathered far greater storms than a late-night jab. He didn't flinch, didn't frown, didn't even shift his posture. If anything, the stillness made him more commanding. The audience noticed it too, laughter fading at the edges as they began to wonder whether Will had gone too far. Keanu turned his head slightly, the hint of a smile touching his lips again, though this time it wasn't amusement. It was something subtler, deeper, the kind of look that suggested patience, but also awareness, a quiet calculation of when the right moment to speak would come. The silence stretched again, the laughter fading into a hum, and for the first time, the balance of energy on the stage wavered. Will had the volume, but Keanu had the gravity. The audience was still buzzing from Will's last impression, their laughter echoing like fading thunder. The studio lights, hot and merciless, gleamed off the polished stage floor, amplifying the charged atmosphere. The host shuffled nervously in his chair, sensing that the playful energy had begun to tip into dangerous territory, but Will was intoxicated by the attention. His grin was wider now, eyes sharper, the rhythm of a performer who knew he had the crowd in the palm of his hand, or at least thought he did. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, and glanced sideways at Keanu, who sat unmoved, the picture of composure. For Will, the contrast was irresistible. Okay, Will said, holding up his hands as if to calm the audience. I'm not saying my man here isn't a legend. Keanu is the guy, right? John Wick, Neo, all that. But let's be real for a second. If you met him at a party, you'd think someone just brought their philosophy professor along for free drinks. The crowd chuckled, some roaring, some nervously glancing at Keanu to see how he would react. The host chuckled too, but it was the uneasy laughter of someone watching a trapeze artist wobble on the wire. Will wasn't finished. He rose slightly from the couch, gesturing dramatically, and slipped into another impersonation. His voice dropped into a mock-serious tone, his movements exaggeratedly slow. Imagine this. Everyone's dancing, the music's pumping, people are having a great time. Then Keanu shows up. Will hunched his shoulders, letting his arms dangle loosely, and shuffled across the stage in mock slow motion. Hey, I'm just gonna stand here, in the corner. The audience laughed harder this time, clapping, some even whistling at the absurdity of the impression. Will straightened, clearly energized by the response, and threw his arms out like a victorious boxer. Come on, that's him, right? Tell me I'm wrong. The camera cut to Keanu. He was smiling faintly, his expression unreadable, his eyes steady. The audience's laughter softened, curiosity seeping in. Keanu had yet to respond, and that silence was beginning to draw more attention than Will's theatrics. The host, eager to maintain balance, turned to Keanu. What do you think, Keanu? Is he nailing it, or what? Keanu tilted his head slightly, as though considering the question carefully. Then he said, in his calm, even tone, I think Will's having fun. The audience chuckled, but the response wasn't quite what they expected. There was no defensiveness, no irritation, just patience. That patience, however, only emboldened Will further. Fun. Oh, buddy, we're just getting started, Will said, clapping his hands. He stood up fully now, towering above the couch, and began strutting across the stage. He slipped into another impersonation, this time mimicking Keanu's iconic line delivery from The Matrix. I know Kung Fu, whoa. He exaggerated the movements, staggering backward with wide eyes, then fell into a mock martial arts stance. The crowd roared again, though this time the laughter carried a jagged edge. Some were still entertained, but others were beginning to shift in their seats, uncomfortable with how one-sided the spectacle had become. Will, oblivious to the shift, pressed on. Look, man, I love you, but sometimes I wonder if you even act. Like, are you acting? Or are you just being Keanu? Just walking in slow motion and saying, whoa. The crowd erupted again, but the host winced, clearly aware that the line had blurred between playful ribbing and outright mockery. The cameras captured Keanu once more, his stillness a striking contrast to Will's manic energy. And then, it happened. Will turned to the audience grinning and said, I mean, let's be honest here. Keanu Reeves is like that guy in high school who never talked to anyone, sat in the back of the class, and then somehow got voted prom king because people just felt sorry for him. The room changed. The laughter faltered. A few nervous chuckles sputtered in the corners, but the majority of the audience fell into a tense hush. The host froze mid-smile, his eyes darting toward Keanu, whose expression had finally shifted. His faint smile was gone now, replaced by something more contemplative, his gaze lowering briefly before lifting again with quiet certainty. The camera zoomed in, capturing the subtle transformation. It was no longer the face of a man absorbing a joke. It was the face of someone who had chosen his moment. The silence stretched uncomfortably. Will glanced around, sensing the drop in energy, and forced another laugh. "Come on, y'all know what I mean. I'm just playing. It's all love." He slapped his chest and gestured toward Keanu with both hands, as though trying to frame it as harmless banter. But the damage was done. The air in the room had shifted, and everyone knew it. Keanu leaned forward slightly, his posture unchanged but his presence suddenly commanding. He hadn't spoken yet, but the audience leaned in as though expecting a revelation. The host, realizing the tension was spiraling beyond his control, muttered into the microphone, "Well, I think we might be about to see a different side of Keanu." The lights seemed hotter now, the room quieter. Will, still standing, tried to maintain his smile, but it no longer carried the same ease. He had pushed too far, mistaking Keanu's silence for weakness. What he hadn't realized was that silence, in the hands of someone like Keanu Reeves, was never weakness. It was preparation. The crowd shifted, breaths held, waiting for the moment. Keanu adjusted in his seat, his hand resting lightly on his knee, his eyes fixed on Will. There was no anger in his gaze, no hostility, only clarity. The kind of clarity that comes when someone has weighed their words carefully, measured the timing, and decided that the moment to speak has finally arrived. The stage lights dimmed slightly for the commercial break countdown, but no one looked away. No one moved. The atmosphere was charged, taut as a drawn bowstring, and all eyes were on the quiet man who had yet to say more than a handful of words all evening. And just as the red recording light above the cameras blinked back on, signaling they were live again, Keanu inhaled softly and lifted his head. It was time. The silence in the studio had become oppressive, a living thing that pressed down on every chair, every spotlight, every breath in the room. Will Smith stood there still grinning, but the edges of his smile were beginning to twitch, revealing the uncertainty creeping beneath his bravado. The audience, caught between the remnants of laughter and the sudden chill of discomfort, sat frozen, their applause forgotten. Even the host, normally master of balance and rhythm, had gone quiet, his cue cards clutched uselessly in his hands. And then, into that silence, Keanu Reeves leaned forward, his hands clasped lightly, his elbows resting on his knees, and his gaze fixed not on Will, but on the floor before lifting slowly, deliberately, until his eyes locked with his fellow guest. There was no heat in his stare, no malice, only clarity, like the surface of a still lake. When he finally spoke, his voice was soft, low, but resonant enough to slice through the tension like a blade. "You know, Will," he began, each word measured, "there's something I've learned after a few decades in this business. People don't remember the jokes at your expense. They don't remember the applause or the laughter that comes at your cost. What they do remember," he paused, letting the air hang heavy, "is how you treated the people who couldn't defend themselves." The shift was immediate and visceral. The audience inhaled as one, the sound of 100 lungs drawing breath at the weight of his words. The laughter that had filled the room only moments ago evaporated completely, leaving behind a stunned, reverent quiet. Keanu did not rush. He let the silence do its work, his calm demeanor amplifying the gravity of what he had said. Will's smile faltered for the first time, the confidence in his eyes dimming as he blinked, momentarily disarmed. The host glanced between them, wide-eyed, his usual witty interjections nowhere to be found. Keanu's voice was not loud, but it carried the force of something undeniable. "Humor is a gift," he continued, "but it's not a weapon. Not something you use to make yourself taller by making someone else smaller. I've sat in the quiet corners you joke about. I've walked into rooms where people only saw the caricature and not the human being. And what I've learned, Will, is that dignity doesn't need to shout. It doesn't need to perform. It just needs to stand." His words hung in the air, heavy and electric, the kind that demanded reflection instead of response. The audience erupted, not with laughter this time, but with a roar of applause so thunderous it rattled the rafters. People were on their feet, clapping, cheering, some even whistling, their energy transformed from mockery to admiration in a heartbeat. The cameras swung frantically to capture the ovation, zooming in on faces shining with awe. The host, overwhelmed, rose half out of his seat, clapping furiously, his expression stunned. Will Smith sat frozen, his usual easy grin gone, replaced by a look that wavered between embarrassment and disbelief. He opened his mouth as if to speak, but nothing came out, his voice swallowed by the roar of the crowd. Keanu remained seated, unmoved, his faint smile returning, not triumphant but gentle, as if to remind everyone that he had not spoken to embarrass Will, but to illuminate something larger. As the applause continued, Keanu finally lifted a hand in a small, almost shy gesture to quiet the room. Slowly, the clapping softened, the energy simmering down but not disappearing. He looked back at Will, his tone steady, almost compassionate now. "You're one of the greatest entertainers alive," he said, his words measured but sincere. "You know how to make people laugh, how to bring joy into a room. That's a powerful thing. But power always comes with a choice. You can use it to lift people up, or you can use it to remind them how low they can fall. Tonight, you tried the second. And maybe that works for a moment. Maybe it gets a laugh. But the first lasts forever." His eyes softened, his faint smile carrying not victory but wisdom. "That's what people will remember." The room was silent now, hanging on every syllable, every flicker of expression on Keanu's face. The host finally found his voice, his tone trembling with admiration. "Ladies and gentlemen, that right there is why they call him a legend." The audience exploded again, a standing ovation that seemed to go on, filling the studio with a thunderous wave of respect and awe. Will Smith sat back down slowly, his shoulders slumping, his face flushed. He clapped along half-heartedly, his earlier confidence shattered, his attempt to mock having backfired in front of millions. Keanu, still calm, still composed, gave a small nod to the crowd before settling back in his seat. He didn't bask in the applause, didn't gloat, didn't even look at Will again. He simply folded his hands once more and lowered his gaze, as if the matter had already been put to rest. And in that moment, under the burning lights and relentless cameras, one truth became undeniable. Keanu Reeves had just turned the stage into a classroom, and everyone, Will, the host, the audience, even those watching at home, had learned something they would never forget. The silence after Keanu's words lingered like the echo of a cathedral bell. It wasn't a silence of awkwardness, but of realization, an invisible weight settling on the shoulders of everyone present. The studio lights shimmered, suddenly feeling warmer, and the audience shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Will Smith, once brimming with charm and control, sat still, his usually animated face now slackened by the collision of pride and humility. His forced smile faltered, giving way to something raw, something the world rarely saw: regret. He looked around for refuge, for a laugh to pull him out, but the audience had already chosen a side, and their silence was not for him. They were watching Keanu, their quiet respect palpable in the way their eyes glistened. The host leaned back, the faintest smile tugging at her lips as if she too understood that something profound had just taken place. Keanu, meanwhile, sat as if nothing extraordinary had happened. His eyes were calm, not triumphant, not cruel, but steady, like a monk who had just shared a simple truth. His humility made the moment even sharper, and the contrast between him and Will seemed insurmountable. Will's voice cracked when he finally spoke, softer than anyone expected. "You know, I wasn't trying to," he started, but the words disintegrated under the weight of Keanu's earlier response. For the first time in his long career, Will seemed like the younger man in the room, the student rather than the star. He looked down at his hands, fiddling with his fingers as though trying to hide behind them. The camera zoomed in, catching every flicker of his discomfort, but instead of humiliation, what the world saw was vulnerability. The crowd, who moments ago might have judged him harshly, now watched with compassion. Because Keanu hadn't destroyed Will, he had gently stripped away the performance, revealing the humanity beneath. It was then that Will turned to Keanu, and though his pride still stung, his eyes softened with something resembling respect. "You're right," he admitted in a near whisper, audible only because of the mic clipped to his lapel. "I should have known better." Keanu, always unwilling to let anyone drown in shame, leaned forward and placed a hand on Will's shoulder, his gesture as genuine as his earlier words. "We're all learning, man," he said quietly, his voice carrying a kindness that disarmed the sting of the moment. "Life's not about how many times you get it right, it's about being willing to grow when you don't." The audience erupted in applause, not just for Keanu's wisdom but for the bridge he had extended. Will's eyes glistened with a sheen that threatened tears, though he quickly blinked them away, fighting to maintain composure. Yet for once, he didn't fight the feeling of being humbled. He nodded, the weight of his earlier attempt at humor finally sinking in, and managed a smile that, unlike before, was stripped of performance, stripped of facade. It was real. The host seized the moment, her voice warm and steady. "Well," she said, her tone both reverent and playful, "I don't think anyone expected philosophy tonight." The audience laughed, the tension dissolving like morning fog under sunlight. But unlike other laughs of the night, this one was cleansing, an exhale that carried admiration. The cameras panned out, capturing the image of two Hollywood giants sitting side by side, not as rivals, but as men, imperfect, human, yet united in that shared moment of vulnerability and respect. Will Smith straightened in his chair, no longer wearing the armor of charisma, but something far more powerful, humility. He glanced at Keanu once more, nodding as if to say thank you, though the words never left his lips. Keanu nodded back, his faint smile one of quiet reassurance. As the applause swelled and the moment cemented itself in the annals of live television history, everyone in the room understood that they had witnessed something bigger than entertainment. They had seen the unraveling of ego, the quiet triumph of humility, and the undeniable proof of why Keanu Reeves was not just beloved, but revered. When the cameras finally faded to black and the red lights blinked off, Will leaned closer, his voice stripped bare. "Man, you've got a way of making me rethink myself," he confessed. And Keanu, with the gentleness of a man who had never sought the spotlight, replied with a smile, "We all need someone to do that once in a while." In that final exchange, the tension, the regret, and the respect all crystallized into something unforgettable, a moment that would echo far beyond the studio walls, replayed endlessly as a testament to grace, humility, and the quiet power of Keanu Reeves.